The morning frost clung to the wooden planks of Millbrook's Main Street like accusations frozen in time. Each breath from the gathered crowd rose in ghostly plumes, disappearing into the gray October sky that pressed down on the settlement with the weight of judgment. The town had awakened to the sound of shouting, the kind that cuts through sleep and pulls people from their beds with dread already settling in their stomachs. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Whitehorse knelt in the dirt outside Morrison's trading post, her once proud shoulders now curved in defeat. The beautiful black hair that had once cascaded down her back in intricate braids now lay scattered around her like fallen leaves, shorn roughly with what looked like a hunting knife. Blood had dried in thin streams from her scalp, mixing with the dust and creating dark stains on the packed earth beneath her knees. The Cherokee woman's buckskin dress, once carefully beaded and pristine, hung in tatters around her frame. Someone had torn the sleeves, and the geometric patterns her grandmother had taught her to sew were now interrupted by jagged rips. Her feet were bare, pale with cold, and small cuts marked where she'd been forced to walk over rough ground. Yet despite the humiliation, despite the pain, her dark eyes held something the crowd couldn't extinguish, a flame of dignity that burned too deep for their cruelty to reach. Thomas Garrison stood over her, his chest puffed with righteousness, a bloodied knife still gripped in his meaty fist. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold, and his breathing came heavy from the exertion of his violence. He was a large man, made larger by his position as the town's unofficial leader, and he used every inch of his bulk to intimidate. His gray beard was stained with tobacco juice, and his small eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a man who had just proven his power to a watching crowd. "Found her stealing from my smokehouse last night," Garrison declared, his voice carrying across the silent street. "Caught her red-handed with my winter meat. These savages think they can just take what they please from Christian folk." He held up a strip of jerky as evidence, waving it like a banner of conquest. "Well, I showed her what we do to thieves in Millbrook." The crowd murmured its approval, though several faces showed discomfort with what they witnessed. Mrs. Elizabeth Harper clutched her shawl tighter and turned her young son's face away from the scene. Old Samuel Reed shuffled his feet and studied the ground with sudden fascination. But most nodded along with Garrison's words, finding it easier to accept his version than to question what they saw with their own eyes. Sheriff Coleman Lynch stood at the edge of the circle, his badge catching the weak morning sun. He was a thin man with nervous hands that constantly fidgeted with his gun belt. His mustache twitched as he watched the proceedings, but he made no move to intervene. Lynch owed his position to men like Garrison, and everyone in Millbrook knew where the real power lay. The law was whatever the influential settlers decided it should be. "She ain't got no husband to speak for her," continued Margaret Wellen, the preacher's wife, her voice sharp with moral certainty. "No Christian folk to vouch for her character. Been skulking around our settlement for weeks now, probably planning to steal us blind." Her pale hands gestured dramatically, silver rings catching the light as she spoke. "The Reverend says these heathens got no concept of property. Think the whole world belongs to them." Sarah Whitehorse said nothing. She hadn't spoken since they dragged her from the smokehouse in the pre-dawn darkness. When Garrison's knife had sawed through her braids, when the women had torn her dress, when the children had thrown stones, through it all, she remained silent. Some said it was a shame that stole her voice. Others whispered it was the devil's tongue within her, finally rendered powerless by Christian justice. The truth was simpler and more devastating. Sarah Whitehorse was the last of her immediate family. The winter sickness had taken her parents and younger brother 3 months ago, leaving her alone in a world that grew more hostile each day. She had come to Millbrook not to steal, but to trade a few precious beads from her grandmother's collection for enough food to survive until spring. But Thomas Garrison had seen an opportunity to send a message, and Sarah had become that message written in humiliation and blood. Dr. William Ashford emerged from his clinic across the street, medical bag in hand. He was younger than most of the town's leadership, with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. His coat was clean and pressed, marking him as one of the few educated men in Millbrook. But even as he approached the circle, his steps slowed. The crowd's energy was ugly, feeding on itself, and Ashford had learned that challenging it directly often made things worse for everyone involved. Perhaps she should be examined for injuries, Ashford suggested carefully, his voice pitched to carry reason rather than confrontation. Head wounds can be serious, and infection. She heal. Garrison cut him off with a dismissive wave. Indians are tough. Nature made them that way for a reason. The big man spat into the dirt near Sarah's knees. Besides, she brought this on herself. Actions have consequences, Doc. That's how civilization works. The crowd pressed closer, drawn by morbid curiosity and the intoxicating sense of collective righteousness. Children peered between adult legs, their young faces absorbing lessons about power and powerlessness that would shape their understanding for years to come. Teenage boys strutted and postured, trying to impress girls with their casual cruelty. The girls themselves whispered behind gloved hands, equally fascinated and repulsed by the display. Sarah's breathing came in controlled measures, each exhalation visible in the cold air. She kept her gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the crowd, as if she could see through the hatred to something else. Perhaps the mountains were her. People still lived free, or the memory of her grandmother's voice singing the old songs. Her lips moved silently, and those closest thought she might be praying to whatever heathen gods her kind worshipped. But Sarah Whitehorse wasn't praying. She was remembering her grandmother's words about dignity being something no enemy could take away unless she surrendered it freely. Remembering the stories of Cherokee women who had faced worse than this and survived. Remembering that survival sometimes looked like defeat to those who didn't understand the difference between losing a battle and losing a war. The wind picked up, sending loose strands of her shorn hair across her face. Each gust carried the scent of wood smoke and coming winter, reminders that the seasons turned regardless of human cruelty. Somewhere in the distance, a crow cawed, once, twice, 3 times. Sarah's grandmother had taught her that crows carried messages between the world of the living and the world of spirits. Perhaps her ancestors were watching. Perhaps they were waiting. Garrison raised his voice again, sensing the crowd's attention beginning to wander. Let this be a lesson to any other savages thinking about helping themselves to Christian property. We built this town with our sweat and blood, and we won't let it be overrun by thieves and beggars. He gestured broadly at the assembled settlers. Every man, woman, and child here knows the difference between right and wrong. We stand together for law and order. The affirmations rose from the crowd like a discordant hymn. That's right, Thomas. About time someone took a stand. Can't let them think they can just waltz in here. But beneath the vocal support, discomfort grew like a slow poison. Some of the older settlers remembered their own desperate times, when survival had meant bending rules and swallowing pride. They remembered what it felt like to be hungry, to be unwelcome, to be judged by those who had arrived at safety before them. Young Timothy Morrison, whose father owned the trading post, shifted nervously in the crowd. He had seen Sarah before, had watched her examining goods with the careful attention of someone who had little money but needed much. She had never tried to steal anything from his father's store. In fact, she had always been polite, always careful to ask permission before touching anything. But Timothy was only 14, and his voice carried no weight against men like Garrison. The sun climbed higher, though its warmth struggled to penetrate the October chill. Sarah's knees had begun to ache from kneeling on the hard ground, but she didn't shift position. Moving might be interpreted as defiance, and defiance would bring more punishment. She had learned this lesson watching other Cherokee who had tried to maintain their pride in the face of settler justice. The key was to endure without breaking, to survive long enough to fight another day. Behind the crowd, horses stamped and snorted in the morning cold. The sound of their breathing and the creak of leather created a steady background rhythm to the human drama unfolding in the street. Some of the mounted men had ridden in from outlying farms, drawn by word of the morning's excitement. They sat their saddles with the easy confidence of men who had never doubted their place in the world's order. Dr. Ashford made another attempt at intervention, this time approaching Sheriff Lynch directly. "Coleman, she needs medical attention. Basic human decency." "Human?" Garrison's voice cracked like a whip. "These creatures ain't human the way we understand it, Doc. There's something in between, something that never learned to live civilized. That's why they can't understand property rights or Christian morality." He pointed the tip of his knife at Sarah's bowed head. "Look at her. No shame, no repentance. Just sitting there like a dumb animal waiting for the storm to pass." The comparison to an animal drew nods from several in the crowd. It was easier to justify cruelty when the victim could be seen as less than fully human. This thinking had allowed the settlers to take Cherokee land, to break Cherokee treaties, to drive Cherokee families from their ancestral homes. If Sarah Whitehorse was not quite human, then her suffering was not quite real. But those who looked closely could see the tremor in her hands, the tight set of her jaw, the careful way she breathed to maintain control. Her suffering was entirely real, as was her determination not to give her tormentors the satisfaction of seeing her break. This quiet resistance only made some in the crowd angrier, as if her dignity was itself an act of defiance. The morning stretched on, and still Sarah knelt in the dirt while Millbrook debated her fate. Some called for her to be driven out of town immediately. Others suggested she be made to work off her theft. A few of the meaner voices suggested punishments that made Dr. Ashford's face pale with disgust. Through it all, Sarah Whitehorse endured, her spirit unbroken even as her body bore the marks of their violence. In the distance, barely visible through the morning haze, smoke rose from Cherokee camps hidden in the mountains. Sarah's people were out there, living free despite the constant pressure to move further west, further from the lands their ancestors had known for generations. They didn't know what was happening to one of their own in the valley below. They couldn't know that Sarah Whitehorse was writing her name in blood and dignity on the main street of a settler town, or that her silent endurance was about to intersect with the conscience of a man who had not yet learned the cost of doing what was right. The sound of approaching hooves cut through the crowd's murmur like a blade through cloth. Not the hurried clatter of someone racing to join the spectacle, but the steady, measured rhythm of a rider who had somewhere to be and wouldn't be deterred from getting there. The crowd began to turn, necks craning to see who dared interrupt their morning's entertainment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus Reed emerged from the morning mist that clung to the valley road, his horses, breath steaming in the cold air. He rode a sturdy chestnut mare with white markings on her face, the kind of reliable mount that spoke of practical choices over flashy displays. Reed himself cut an unremarkable figure at first glance, average height, brown hair showing gray at the temples, wearing the worn leather coat and canvas pants of a working rancher. But there was something in the way he sat his saddle, a quiet solidity that suggested a man comfortable with his own decisions. Reed had been riding since before dawn, making his monthly trip to Millbrook for supplies. His ranch lay 15 miles north in the Copper Valley, where he ran cattle with the help of 2 hired men and his own stubborn determination. He wasn't wealthy by any measure, but he was independent, and that independence had cost him more friends than it had gained him over the years. Most folks in these parts preferred their neighbors to think the same thoughts and hold the same opinions. Marcus Reed had never been particularly accommodating in that regard. As he drew closer to the crowd, Reed's experienced eye took in the scene with growing discomfort. He saw Thomas Garrison holding court like some petty king, saw Sheriff Lynch standing uselessly to one side, saw the woman kneeling in the dirt with blood in her hair. Reed had seen enough frontier justice to recognize it when he encountered it, and he had long ago decided that most frontier justice was neither frontier nor just. Reed's mare picked her way carefully through the edge of the crowd, which parted reluctantly to let them pass. He didn't greet anyone, didn't acknowledge the stares that followed his progress. His attention was fixed on the woman in the center of the circle, taking in her torn clothing, her shorn hair, the careful way she held herself despite obvious pain. When their eyes met for a brief moment, Reed saw something that made his jaw tighten, not defeat, not surrender, but a kind of fierce endurance that reminded him of cornered wildlife that refused to stop fighting. "Morning, Marcus," called out James Fletcher, a farmer whose land bordered Reed's property. Fletcher's voice carried forced cheer, the kind men used when they wanted to include you in something you hadn't asked to join. "Come to see justice served on this thieving savage?" Reed didn't answer immediately. He dismounted slowly, taking his time to tie his mare's reins to the hitching post outside Morrison's store. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world and no particular interest in the drama unfolding around him. But those who knew Reed well might have noticed the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his hands stayed loose and ready at his sides. "What's she accused of?" Reed asked finally, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. It was a simple question, asked in a conversational tone, but it had the effect of momentarily silencing the crowd. Most of them had been so caught up in the righteousness of the punishment that they had stopped thinking about the specifics of the crime. Thomas Garrison stepped forward, reasserting his dominance over the proceedings. "Caught her stealing meat from my smokehouse, Reed, red-handed, middle of the night. Can't let these savages think they can just help themselves to Christian property." Garrison's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty, the tone of a man who had never been wrong about anything in his life. Reed's gray eyes moved from Garrison to the woman, then back to Garrison. "You see her take it? What?" Garrison's confidence flickered slightly. "Did you see her take the meat, with your own eyes?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a green fire. Garrison's face reddened slightly, and he shifted his weight from foot to foot. "I found her near the smokehouse. Meat was missing. Don't take much detective work to figure out what happened, so you didn't see her take it." "Reed, what the hell are you? And she had the meat on her when you found her?" Garrison's face was growing redder by the minute. Several in the crowd began to murmur, sensing the direction of Reed's questions. Sheriff Lynch straightened slightly, his hand moving unconsciously toward his gun belt. "Now, Marcus," Lynch said, his voice carrying a warning. "Thomas here is a respected member of our community. If he says she stole from him, then she stole from him," Reed finished. "But if he didn't see her do it, and she didn't have the meat when he found her, then what we have here is a woman beaten and shamed based on suspicion." Reed's voice remained calm, conversational, but there was something underneath it now, something that made several of the crowd take an unconscious step backward. Dr. Ashford found his voice. "Marcus is right. Without proof, without witnesses. This is hardly, she's a damned Indian," Garrison exploded. "They steal, it's what they do. You think she was out there in the middle of the night picking flowers?" Spittle flew from his lips as he spoke, and his grip on the bloody knife tightened until his knuckles showed white. Reed looked at Garrison for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the crowd. "I've known thieves, Thomas. White ones, red ones, black ones. But I've also known hungry people, and there's a difference between the two that matters." The words fell into the crowd like stones into still water, creating ripples of discomfort that spread outward from the center. Margaret Welland, the preacher's wife, drew herself up to her full height. "Are you suggesting we should allow heathens to steal from Christian folk whenever they claim hunger as an excuse?" "I'm suggesting," Reed said, still in that same quiet voice, "that maybe we should make sure someone actually stole something before we start cutting their hair off with hunting knives." The silence that followed was different from before. Where there had been righteous certainty, now there was doubt. Where there had been unity, now there were questioning glances. Reed had done something dangerous. He had introduced logic into an emotional situation. And logic had a way of making people uncomfortable when they preferred their outrage simple and uncomplicated. Reed stepped toward the center of the circle, moving slowly so as not to provoke anyone into hasty action. Sarah Whitehorse watched him approach, her dark eyes tracking his movement with the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust unexpected kindness. When Reed knelt beside her, she tensed as if expecting another blow, but Reed didn't touch her. Instead, he examined the cuts on her scalp with the clinical attention of someone who had treated injured animals. "These need cleaning," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "Head wounds can fester if they're not properly tended." "She ain't your concern, Reed," Garrison growled. "This is town business, and you don't even live in town." Reed looked up at Garrison, and for the first time, there was something hard in his gray eyes. "A woman bleeding in the street is everyone's concern, Thomas. Or at least it should be." "Doctor." Ashford moved closer, his medical bag still clutched in his hand. "I offered to examine her injuries, but nothing," Reed interrupted, rising to his feet. "She's hurt, and you're a doctor. Do your job." The confrontation was building toward something that everyone could feel, but no one wanted to name. Reed stood between Sarah and the crowd now, not dramatically, not like some hero from a dime novel, but simply and solidly, like a man who had decided where he belonged and intended to stay there. Sheriff Lynch stepped forward, his hand now resting openly on his gun butt. "Marcus, I think you better step aside and let us handle this situation. You're not a lawman, and you're interfering with official business." Reed's laugh was dry and humorless. "Official business? What law says a woman can be beaten and shorn? Without trial? What statute covers guilty until proven innocent?" His eyes moved across the crowd, meeting as many gazes as would hold steady under his stare. "I've read the territorial codes, Coleman. I know what passes for law around here, and this isn't it." Young Timothy Morrison found his voice from somewhere in the crowd. "Mr. Reed, she was just looking at things in our store yesterday. Didn't try to steal anything. Was real polite, actually." The words were spoken quietly, but in the tense silence they carried like gunshots. Garrison whirled toward the boy, his face apoplectic. "Timothy Morrison, you shut your mouth. You don't know what you're talking about." But the damage was done. If Sarah had been polite in the store, if she had been looking rather than stealing, then perhaps she wasn't the savage thief Garrison had painted her to be. Perhaps she was just a hungry woman who had made the mistake of being in the wrong place when Thomas Garrison needed someone to blame for his troubles. Reed sensed the shift in the crowd's mood and pressed his advantage. "Sarah," he said, using her name for the first time. The sound of it seemed to surprise her, as if she hadn't expected anyone in this place to know she had a name. "Sarah, can you stand?" She looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for some sign of trick or trap. Finding none, she placed her hands flat on the ground and pushed herself slowly to her feet. Her legs trembled slightly from kneeling so long in the cold, but she managed to stand upright, her chin lifted with quiet dignity. Reed shrugged out of his heavy leather coat and held it out to her. "It's cold," he said simply. Sarah stared at the coat as if it were some foreign object she couldn't identify. No one in Millbrook had offered her anything but violence and shame. This simple gesture of basic human kindness seemed to confuse her more than all of Garrison's brutality. "Don't you dare," Garrison snarled. stepping toward Reed with the knife still in his hand. "Don't you dare treat that savage like she's some kind of lady. She's a thief and a vagrant, and I won't have you making a mockery of justice in my town." Reed turned to face Garrison fully, and something in his movement made the bigger man hesitate. Reed wasn't as large as Garrison, wasn't as loud or as mean, but there was something in his stance that suggested he had been in this kind of situation before and wasn't particularly worried about the outcome. "Your town, Thomas?" Reed's voice was soft, almost conversational. "I didn't realize you'd been elected mayor, or sheriff, or judge and jury." His gray eyes never left Garrison's face. "Far as I know, you're just a man with a knife and a bad temper, and that doesn't give you the right to butcher women in the street." The word butcher hit the crowd like a physical blow. It was ugly, specific, and accurate in a way that made several people look away in shame. Margaret Wellen gasped audibly, and even some of Garrison's staunchest supporters seemed to wilt under the weight of what they had been party to. Reed turned back to Sarah and again offered her his coat. This time she took it, her fingers trembling, as she wrapped it around her shoulders. The leather was warm from his body heat and smelled of honest work, horses and cattle and clean sweat. It was the first gentle thing she had experienced since being dragged from her hiding place before dawn. "Now," Reed said, his voice carrying across the crowd, "I'm going to take Sarah to Doc Ashford's clinic so he can tend to her wounds. Anyone who has a problem with that can discuss it with me later." Privately, the last word carried weight that everyone understood. Reed was offering to settle the matter man to man, away from the crowd, where courage would be measured differently then. "It was here in the safety of numbers, Doc Sheriff." Lynch cleared his throat nervously. "Marcus, you can't just—" "Can't what?" Reed's attention snapped to the sheriff like a hawk focusing on prey. "Can't show basic human decency? Can't insist that the law be followed? Can't keep a woman from bleeding to death in the street while good Christian folks stand around and watch?" His voice rose slightly for the first time, carrying an edge that made Lynch take a step backward. Dr. Ashford stepped forward, his courage bolstered by Reed's support. "Yes, bring her to the clinic. These wounds need immediate attention." Reed nodded once, then gently placed his hand under Sarah's elbow to guide her toward the doctor's office. She flinched at the contact but didn't pull away, perhaps sensing that this touch was different from the others she had endured that morning. As they walked through the crowd, people moved aside to let them pass. Some watched with obvious disapproval, others with something that might have been shame. A few looked away entirely, unable to meet Reed's steady gaze or the quiet dignity in Sarah's bearing. Behind them, Garrison's voice rose in frustrated anger. "This isn't over, Reed. You can't come into our town and tell us how to handle our business. That woman is a thief and a vagrant, and all your soft-hearted nonsense won't change that." Reed didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge the threat. He simply continued walking, one hand lightly guiding Sarah toward medical attention, the other hanging loose and ready at his side. His mare followed them down the street, reins trailing, as if she too understood that something important was happening, and wanted no part of the ugliness they were leaving behind. As they reached the clinic door, Sarah looked up at Reed with eyes that held a mixture of gratitude and wariness. She still didn't speak, couldn't speak, or wouldn't, but something passed between them in that moment, some recognition of shared humanity that transcended the barriers of race and culture and circumstance. Reed opened the clinic door and stepped aside to let her enter first. It was a small gesture, but in a world where she had been treated as less than human, even small gestures carried enormous weight. As Sarah stepped across the threshold into the warmth and safety of Dr. Ashford's clinic, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the possibility that not all white men were her enemies. Behind them, the crowd began to disperse, their morning's entertainment ruined by the introduction of conscience and common sense. But the murmurs that followed Reed and Sarah down the street were different now, uncertain. as if a seed of doubt had been planted in soil that had previously been thought barren. Thomas Garrison stood alone in the middle of the street, his bloody knife still clutched in his fist, his face red with frustrated rage. He had been robbed of his triumph, his moment of absolute power, and he knew that Marcus Reed would pay for that theft. But as he looked around at the dispersing crowd, at the faces that no longer met his eyes with unquestioning support, Garrison began to understand that he might not be the only one who would face consequences for what had happened that morning. Dr. Ashford's clinic smelled of carbolic acid and dried herbs, a sharp contrast to the dust and violence of the street outside. Sarah sat on the examination table, Reed's coat still wrapped around her shoulders like armor against the world's cruelty. The doctor worked with quiet efficiency, cleaning the wounds on her scalp with gentle hands that spoke of years spent mending. Both animals and people on the frontier. "The cuts aren't as deep as they look," Ashford murmured, more to himself than to his companions. "Head wounds always bleed heavily, but these should heal cleanly if we keep them clean." He dabbed iodine on the worst of the cuts, and Sarah's jaw tightened, but she made no sound. Her silence had become a fortress, and she retreated deeper into it with each passing moment. Reed stood near the window, ostensibly watching the street, but actually giving Sarah space to be tended without feeling observed. He could see the remnants of the crowd still lingering outside Morrison's store, their voices carrying through the glass in angry murmurs. Thomas Garrison was at the center of the group, his gestures becoming more animated as he worked to rebuild the righteous fury that Reed's intervention had disrupted. "She needs somewhere safe to recover," Dr. Ashford said quietly, wrapping a clean bandage around Sarah's head. "These wounds need to be checked daily for signs of infection, and she's clearly exhausted. When did you last eat?" He asked Sarah directly. She looked at him with those dark eyes that seemed to hold depths of sorrow, but she didn't answer. Her hands remained folded in her lap, fingers interlaced so tightly the knuckles showed white beneath her bronze skin. 3 days, maybe 4, Reed said from the window. Both Sarah and Dr. Ashford turned to look at him in surprise. "I can see it in her face, in the way she holds herself. I've seen enough hungry people to recognize the signs." Dr. Ashford frowned. 4 days without food, had trauma, exposure to cold. She needs rest and regular meals, not to mention protection from further harassment. He looked meaningfully at Reed. "I don't suppose you have any suggestions about where she might find such things?" Reed was quiet for a long moment, still watching the street. The crowd was dispersing now, but slowly, reluctantly, like people leaving a theater before the final act. He could see Sheriff Lynch talking earnestly with Garrison, their heads bent together in conversation that probably didn't bode well for anyone who had interfered with the morning's entertainment. "My ranch," Reed said finally. "It's far enough from town that she'd be safe, at least for a while." Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes wide with something that might have been alarm. The idea of going even further into white man's territory, of being alone with a stranger whose motive she couldn't fathom, clearly terrified her more than staying in Millbrook. Dr. Ashford caught the look and spoke gently. "Sarah, you need time to heal. Marcus Reed is a good man, one of the few around here who judges people by their actions rather than their appearance. You'd be safe with him." Still she said nothing, but Reed could see the conflict playing out behind her eyes. Trust no one. Her experience had taught her. Every kindness was a trap, every offer of help a prelude to something worse. But staying in Millbrook meant facing Thomas Garrison's continued rage, and that was a certainty rather than a possibility. Reed turned from the window and looked directly at her, for the first time since they'd entered the clinic. "I have a spare room," he said simply. "No obligations, no expectations. Just a safe place to get your strength back. When you're ready to leave, you leave, no questions asked." The simplicity of the offer seemed to catch Sarah off guard. She searched his face for hidden meanings, for the ulterior motives that surely lurked behind such generosity. But Reed's gray eyes held nothing but honest concern, and after a moment, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The ride to Reed's ranch took 2 hours along mountain trails that wound through stands of aspen and pine. Sarah rode behind Reed on his mare, her hands gripping the saddle horn rather than touching him, maintaining what distance she could while still sharing the horse. She had accepted Dr. Ashford's spare cloak to go with Reed's coat, and bundled. In both garments, she looked like a refugee from some forgotten war. Reed didn't try to make conversation during the ride. He could feel the tension in her posture, the way she held herself ready to jump from the horse and run if necessary. Trust would come slowly, if it came at all, and he had learned long ago that trying to force such things usually drove them away entirely. The Copper Valley spread out before them as they crested the final ridge, a wide expanse of grassland bordered by pine-covered hills. Reed's ranch house sat in the center of the valley like a ship anchored in a sea of gold and brown grass. It was a modest building, built for function rather than beauty, but it looked solid and permanent in a way that suggested a man who intended to stay put and weather whatever storms came his way. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating that one of Reed's hired hands had kept the fires burning in his absence. As they approached the house, 2 men emerged from the barn: Frank Dalton, a grizzled cowhand in his 50s, and Pete Hawkins, younger and eager, with the kind of enthusiasm that only came from being new to ranch work. Both men stopped in their tracks when they saw Sarah, their faces registering surprise and something that might have been concern. Reed dismounted and helped Sarah down from the horse, his movements careful and respectful of her obvious discomfort with physical contact. "Frank Pete," Reed said by way of introduction. "This is Sarah. She'll be staying with us for a while, recovering from some injuries. I trust that won't be a problem." Frank Dalton had worked for Reed for 3 years and had learned to trust his boss's judgment even when he didn't understand it. Pete was newer to the ranch but had quickly learned that Frank's opinion carried weight, and if Frank was comfortable with something, it was probably worth accepting. "No problem at all, boss," Frank said, touching the brim of his hat in Sarah's direction. "Miss Sarah, welcome to the Copper Valley Ranch." Pete nodded agreement, his young face earnest. "Yes, ma'am. Anything you need, just let us know." Sarah looked between the 2 men with obvious surprise. She had expected suspicion, hostility, perhaps outright refusal to allow her on the property. Instead, she was being welcomed as if her presence was perfectly normal, as if Cherokee women showed up at remote ranches every day seeking sanctuary. Reed led her toward the house, leaving Frank and Pete to tend to the horse. The front door opened into a main room that served as both kitchen and living area, dominated by a large stone fireplace that filled the space with warmth and the scent of burning pine. The furnishings were simple but well made: a wooden table with 4 chairs, a couple of comfortable armchairs near the fire, shelves lined with books and practical necessities. "The spare room is through there," Reed said, indicating a door on the far side of the main room. "It's not much, but it's private and warm. There's a wash basin and clean linens." He paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. "The front door doesn't have a lock, but your room does. The key is on the inside." The significance of this detail wasn't lost on Sarah. Reed was telling her that she could lock him out if she chose, that she would have complete control over her own space and safety. It was a small thing, but in her current circumstances, small things carried enormous weight. Reed showed her to the room, which was indeed simple but clean and comfortable. A single bed with thick quilts, a small table with a mirror, a wardrobe for clothes, and a window that looked out over the valley. Most importantly, it felt safe, a place where she could close the door and breathe without constantly watching for threats. "I'll have Frank bring you some hot water for washing," Reed said from the doorway. "And there's stew on the stove when you're ready to eat. No hurry, Take whatever time you need to settle in." After he left, Sarah stood in the center of the small room and tried to process what was happening to her. Less than 4 hours ago, she had been kneeling in the dirt of Millbrook's Main Street, beaten and humiliated, facing an uncertain future that probably included more violence or death. Now she was in a warm, safe room with a locked door and the promise of food and medical care. She moved to the window and looked out over the valley. The late afternoon sun painted the grassland in shades of gold and amber, and she could see cattle grazing peacefully in the distance. It was beautiful in a way that reminded her of Cherokee land, of the valleys where her people had lived before the white settlers came. But it was also alien territory, a place where she had no roots, no connections, no understanding of the rules that governed daily life. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Sarah?" It was Frank's voice, carefully respectful. "Got some hot water for you, and clean towels." She opened the door to find the older cowhand holding a steaming pitcher and a stack of white towels. His weathered face was kind, and his eyes held none of the suspicion or hostility she had learned to expect from white men. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice rusty from disuse. Frank's face lit up with surprise at hearing her speak. "You're very welcome, miss. Boss said to tell you that supper's ready whenever you are, but no pressure if you'd rather rest first." After Frank left, Sarah poured the hot water into the basin and began the careful process of washing away the physical traces of her ordeal. The warm water stung the cuts on her scalp, but felt wonderful on her cold hands and face. She had to be careful with her movements. Her body was stiff and sore from kneeling for so long, and the emotional trauma had left her feeling fragile and disconnected from her own physical self. When she was clean, she looked at herself in the small mirror above the basin. The reflection that stared back was both familiar and strange. Her hair was growing back in uneven patches, making her look younger and more vulnerable than her 23 years. The bandage around her head gave her an invalid's appearance, and the borrowed clothes hung loose on her thin frame. But her eyes were still her own, dark, intelligent, and increasingly determined. She could hear quiet conversation from the main room, Reed's voice mixing with those of his men as they discussed ranch business. The normalcy of it struck her as almost miraculous. These men were going about their daily routines, treating her presence as just another factor to be accommodated, nothing more dramatic or threatening than unexpected weather. When she finally emerged from her room, she found Reed alone at the kitchen table, reading what appeared to be a letter. He looked up as she approached and gestured to the chair across from him. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Better," she said, and was surprised to find that it was true. The simple acts of washing and changing into clean clothes had restored some sense of herself as a person rather than a victim. Reed ladled stew into a bowl and placed it before her, along with thick slices of bread and a glass of milk. The food was simple but well prepared, and Sarah found herself eating with more appetite than she'd had in weeks. Reed ate his own meal in companionable silence, occasionally glancing at her to make sure she was comfortable, but not staring or making her feel like an object of curiosity. "Frank and Pete are good men," Reed said eventually. "They'll treat you with respect. But if anyone makes you uncomfortable, if you feel unsafe for any reason, you tell me immediately." Sarah nodded, understanding that he was giving her permission to set boundaries, to protect herself, to demand the basic dignity that had been stripped from her in Millbrook. "How long can I stay?" she asked. Reed considered the question seriously. "As long as you need to. Winter's coming on, and travel will be difficult soon. You're welcome to stay through the cold months if you want." The offer was generous almost beyond belief. Sarah had expected a few days at most, just long enough for her wounds to stop bleeding and her strength to return. The possibility of staying through winter, of having a safe place to live for months, was something she hadn't dared to hope for. Over the following days, a routine developed that felt almost like normal life. Sarah's room became her sanctuary, a place where she could retreat when the outside world felt too overwhelming. But increasingly, she found herself spending time in the main room, watching Reed work on ranch accounts or reading from his surprisingly extensive library. Reed was a man of few words, but Sarah began to appreciate the quality of his silence. Unlike the threatening quiet of Millbrook streets, Reed's silence was comfortable, peaceful. He didn't seem to expect conversation from her, didn't try to draw her out or make her perform gratitude for his kindness. He simply accepted her presence. And went about his business with the same steady competence he brought to everything else. She began to help with small tasks around the house, washing dishes, mending clothes, preparing simple meals. These activities felt good, gave her a sense of purpose and contribution rather than mere dependence. Reed accepted her help without comment, as if it was perfectly natural for a Cherokee woman to be managing his household. Frank and Pete treated her with the same respectful courtesy they showed their boss. They tipped their hats when they saw her, asked politely about her health, and included her in the easy conversation that flowed between men who worked well together. Neither of them seemed to find anything unusual about her presence, and their acceptance helped her begin to relax in ways she hadn't realized were possible. One evening, about a week after her arrival, Sarah was sitting by the fire working on mending one of Reed's shirts when he came in from checking on the cattle. His clothes were damp with mist, and his hair was disheveled from the wind, but he looked content in the way of a man who had finished a good day's work. "Storm coming in," he said, hanging his coat by the door. "Should hit sometime tomorrow. We'll be housebound for a few days." Sarah looked up from her mending. The idea of being trapped inside with Reed for days would have terrified her when she first arrived. Now it felt almost comforting. The ranch had become a refuge not just from physical danger, but from the constant vigilance that had defined her life for so long. "I've been thinking," Reed said, settling into his chair with a cup of coffee. "When spring comes, if you want to return to your people, I'll help you get there safely. But if you want to stay, if you want to make a life here, that's possible too." Sarah's hand stilled on the shirt she was mending. The offer was unprecedented, generous beyond anything she could have imagined. A white man was offering her not just temporary shelter, but a permanent home, a place where she could belong. "Why?" she asked softly. Reed was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful, as if he was working out the answer as he gave it. "I've spent a lot of years alone out here," he said. "Built this place with my own hands, run cattle, made a living. But it's been a solitary life, and solitary gets old after a while. Having you here, having someone to share meals with, to talk with in the evenings, it's made me remember what I've been missing." He looked at her then, his gray eyes serious. "You're good company, Sarah. You're intelligent, you're strong, and you've got a way of making the place feel like home just by being in it. I'd be honored if you chose to stay." Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, some knot of fear and loneliness beginning to loosen. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't involve constant flight, constant fear, constant struggle just to survive. She imagined herself living in this valley, helping to run this ranch, building something stable and good with this quiet, decent man who had risked his own safety to protect her. "I'll think about it," she said, and knew that she already had. The first sign of trouble came with the arrival of Ezra Mills, the circuit preacher who made monthly rounds through the scattered settlements of the territory. Mills was a thin, sharp-featured man with pale eyes that seemed to pierce straight through to a person's soul, cataloging sins and shortcomings with the efficiency of a bookkeeper. He arrived at the ranch on a gray November morning, his black horse as severe and unforgiving as its rider. Reed was in the barn checking on a lame mare when Mills rode up, his presence announced by the agitated barking of the ranch dogs. Sarah, who had been hanging laundry behind the house, felt her stomach clench with familiar dread at the sound of approaching hooves. She had learned to associate unexpected visitors with trouble, and the sight of the stern man in black did nothing to ease her anxiety. "Marcus Reed," Mills called out as Reed emerged from the barn. "I believe we need to have a conversation." Reed nodded politely, though his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Preacher Mills, what brings you out this way?" Mills dismounted with the careful movements of a man who spent more time in the saddle than he preferred. His pale eyes swept the ranch, taking in every detail with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to judging moral landscapes. When his gaze fell on Sarah, still visible near the clothesline, his expression hardened. "I think you know exactly what brings me here," Mills said, his voice carrying the weight of righteous authority. "The entire territory is talking about your house guest." Frank Dalton emerged from the bunkhouse, his weathered face creased with concern. He had dealt with circuit preachers before and knew they rarely brought good news to remote ranches. Pete Hawkins appeared a moment later, younger and less experienced but quick to read the tension in the air. "Sarah's recovering from injuries," Reed said evenly. "Dr. Ashford recommended rest and proper care." Mills snorted with derision. "Dr. Ashford is a good man, but he's been led astray by misplaced compassion. That woman is a savage, Reed. A heathen, whose very presence corrupts the moral fabric of our Christian community." Sarah couldn't hear the words clearly from her position by the clothesline, but she could read the hostility in Mills' posture, the way he gestured in her direction like she was some kind of pestilence to be discussed and disposed of. She had encountered men like Mills before, men who used God's name to justify their hatred, who found Scripture to support whatever cruelty they wished to inflict. Reed's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath it. "What exactly are you suggesting, preacher?" "I'm suggesting that you've allowed yourself to be deceived by a creature that knows nothing of Christian virtue. That woman has bewitched you, Reed. She's using feminine wiles and savage magic to cloud your judgment." Mills' voice grew louder as he warmed to his theme. "The good people of Millbrook are scandalized. They're questioning your moral character, your fitness to be part of this community." Frank stepped closer, his hand resting casually on the handle of the axe he'd been using to split firewood. Pete followed suit, flanking Reed in a show of solidarity that wasn't lost on the preacher. Mills might represent divine authority to some, but on the Copper Valley Ranch, Marcus Reed's word was law. "The good people of Millbrook," Reed repeated, his tone suggesting he found the phrase somewhat amusing. "Would those be the same good people who stood around watching while Thomas Garrison beat a defenseless woman with a hunting knife?" Mills' face flushed red. That woman was caught stealing. Garrison was within his rights to demand justice. Garrison was within his rights to report a theft to the sheriff, Reed corrected. He wasn't within his rights to act as judge, jury, and executioner. And as I recall, no one actually saw Sarah steal anything. The use of Sarah's name seemed to infuriate Mills even more. "You speak of that savage as if she were a Christian woman, as if she had a soul worth saving." He pulled himself up to his full height, drawing on decades of practice in moral intimidation. "Reed, I'm here as a friend, as a servant of God to warn you that you're walking down a path that leads to damnation." Sarah had moved closer during the conversation, drawn by the rising voices and her own growing concern for Reed's safety. She could see the anger building in Mills' face, could read the fanatical certainty that made men like him so dangerous. She had witnessed such men before, had seen what they could do when their sense of righteousness was threatened. "Furthermore," Mills continued, his voice rising to the practiced cadence of a Sunday sermon, "your actions have consequences beyond your own soul. The territorial government is paying attention, Reed. There are officials in Denver who don't appreciate settlers who consort with savages, who undermine the work of civilizing this frontier." The threat was not subtle. Mills was suggesting that Reed's protection of Sarah could result in official sanctions, loss of property rights, perhaps even criminal charges. In the territories, where law was often a matter of interpretation and political connections carried more weight than justice, such threats had real teeth. Reed was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes studying Mills with the same calm attention. He might give to a rattlesnake coiled in his path. When he spoke, his voice was soft but carried clearly in the morning air. "Preacher, I've read the Bible more than once. I don't recall the part where Jesus turned away strangers, where he refused to help the wounded, where he condemned people based on the color of their skin or the language they spoke." Reed paused, letting his words sink in. "Maybe you could point me to that passage, because I seem to have missed it." Mill's face went from red to purple. "Don't you dare quote scripture to me, you godless fool. That woman is a temptress, a daughter of Satan sent to lead righteous men astray. She's corrupted your thinking, made you forget your duty to your own race, your own people." "My own people," Reed repeated thoughtfully. "You mean people like Thomas Garrison? People who beat defenseless women? People who stand around and cheer while it happens?" He shook his head slowly. "If that's what passes for my people, preacher, then maybe I need to find better people." The confrontation was building toward something ugly, and Frank Dalton stepped forward with the easy authority of a man who had handled more than his share of difficult situations. "Preacher Mills," he said respectfully but firmly, "I think you've said your piece. Maybe it's time you continued on your circuit." Mills whirled toward Frank, his pale eyes blazing with fanatic fury. "Don't think I haven't heard about you too, Dalton. A man who works for Reed, who enables this abomination. The Lord sees all, and judgment comes to those who aid and abet corruption." Pete Hawkins, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally found his voice. "With respect, preacher, Miss Sarah ain't done nothing but help around the ranch and mind her own business. She's been nothing but polite and helpful since she got here. Miss Sarah?" Mill's voice cracked with outrage. "You address that savage with courtesy due to a Christian lady? Have you all lost your minds?" Sarah had heard enough. The conversation was clearly about her, clearly threatening to the people who had shown her kindness, and she refused to hide behind Reed's protection any longer. She walked around the corner of the house and approached the group, her chin lifted. With quiet dignity, despite the fear that coiled in her stomach. "I am here," she said simply, her voice carrying clearly in the tense air. "If you have words for me, speak them to my face." The sight of her seemed to inflame Mills even further. He pointed at her with a trembling finger, his voice rising to the pitch of evangelical fury. "There! You see how brazenly she displays herself. How she speaks as if she were the equal of Christian men. This is what comes of treating savages as if they were human." Reed stepped between Sarah and Mills, his movements smooth and deliberate. "Careful, preacher. You're a guest on my land, and guests are expected to show basic courtesy." "Courtesy?" Mills laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You speak of courtesy while harboring a heathen seductress under your roof. The entire territory knows what's happening here, Reed. They know you've taken a savage woman as your concubine, that you've abandoned Christian morality for the base pleasures of the flesh." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire, ugly and persistent. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from shame but from anger. She had endured much in her life, but having her honor questioned by a man who knew nothing about her was more than she could bear in silence. "You know nothing," she said, her voice low but carrying clearly. "You speak of things you do not understand, make judgments about people you have never tried to know. Your words are poison, and your heart is closed to truth." Mills stared at her as if she had sprouted horns and breathed fire. "It speaks. The savage dares to speak back to a man of God. Reed, this is what your misplaced charity has created. A heathen who thinks herself entitled to argue with her betters." "Her betters?" Reed's voice was dangerous now, quiet and controlled in a way that made Frank and Pete exchange worried glances. "Preacher, I've known Sarah for almost a month now. In that time, I've seen her work harder than most men, show more courage than most soldiers, and display more genuine kindness than most Christians. If she's anybody's inferior, it sure as hell isn't yours." The profanity seemed to push Mills over the edge of whatever self-control he had been maintaining. "Blasphemy! You defend this creature with foul language and corrupted reasoning. The devil has his claws in you, Reed, and he's using this temptress to drag you down to perdition." Sarah stepped forward, moving past Reed despite his protective presence. She looked directly at Mills, her dark eyes steady and unafraid. "I do not know your God," she said quietly. "But if your God teaches you to hate people you do not know, to justify cruelty with prayers, to speak of love while practicing hatred, then perhaps your God is not as wise as you believe." The words hit Mills like physical blows. His face went white, then red, then white again. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly as he struggled to find words adequate to express his outrage. When he finally spoke, his voice shook with fury. "Heresy! Blasphemy! Corruption!" He pointed at Reed with a trembling finger. "You have brought damnation upon yourself, Marcus Reed. You have chosen the path of sin, and you will reap the consequences. The righteous people of this territory will not stand for this abomination." Mills turned on his heel and stalked toward his horse, his black coat billowing behind him like the wings of some wrathful bird. As he mounted, he turned back to face the small group still standing near the barn. "Mark my words, Reed. This will not stand. The forces of righteousness will not allow you to corrupt this territory with your heathen ways. You have made enemies today, powerful enemies who will not rest until this evil is purged from our Christian land." With that, Mills spurred his horse and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and the echo of his threats hanging in the morning air. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The confrontation had been ugly, frightening in its intensity, and everyone present understood that it was only the beginning. Frank was the first to break the silence. "Boss, that was a bad business. Mills has got influence with the territorial authorities, and he's got a long memory for grudges." Reed nodded grimly. "I know, but what was I supposed to do? Stand there and let him insult Sarah? Let him spread his poison without answering back?" "You did right," Pete said firmly. "Standing up to bullies is always right, even when they wear preacher's clothes." Sarah looked between the three men, seeing the concern in their faces, understanding that her presence had brought trouble to people who had shown her nothing but kindness. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like a physical burden. "Perhaps I should leave," she said quietly. "Find my own people, stop bringing danger to yours." Reed turned to look at her, his gray eyes serious but kind. "Sarah, running away won't solve anything. Mills and his kind don't just hate you. They hate anyone who doesn't think exactly like they do. If you leave, they'll just find someone else to persecute. But if I stay, they'll come after you." "They were always going to come after me eventually," Reed replied. "Men like Mills can't stand it when someone refuses to bow down to their authority." The only question was what excuse they'd use. Over the following weeks, the consequences of Mills' visit began to manifest in ways both subtle and obvious. Reed's usual suppliers in Millbrook became suddenly reluctant to fill his orders. Prices for goods he needed rose inexplicably. The monthly poker game that had been a fixture of his social life for years simply stopped including him. The invitations drying up without explanation. Frank reported that other ranchers were asking pointed questions about the situation at the Copper Valley Ranch. Some expressed concern for Reed's welfare, suggesting he was being manipulated by a savage woman. Others were more direct in their disapproval, making it clear that Reed's choices were affecting his standing in the community. Pete, who was young and social, found himself increasingly isolated when he went to town. Former friends crossed the street to avoid him, and the pretty daughters of respectable families suddenly had no time for a young man who worked for Marcus Reed, The social pressure was designed to force him to choose between his job and his acceptance in the community. But perhaps the most troubling development was the change in Sheriff Lynch's attitude. Where once he had been merely incompetent, now he seemed actively hostile. He began making unannounced visits to the ranch, ostensibly to check on reports of suspicious activity. He questioned Frank and Pete about Sarah's behavior, asked pointed questions about Reed's state of mind, and made veiled threats about the consequences of harboring undesirable elements. During one such visit, Lynch made his intentions clear. "Reed, I got a lot of pressure from above to do something about your situation here. Important people are asking questions, and they don't like the answers they're getting." Reed had been shoeing a horse when Lynch arrived, and he continued his work without looking up. "What kind of questions, Coleman?" "Questions about why a respectable rancher is living in sin with a savage woman. Questions about whether you're still fit to hold property in this territory. Questions about whether the law is being properly enforced in this county." Sarah, who had been working in the garden, could hear the conversation clearly. Each word felt like a stone thrown at her heart. These good people were suffering because of her presence, losing friends and facing threats because they had shown her kindness. "You threatening me, Coleman?" Reed's voice was steady, but his hands had stilled on the horse's hoof. "I'm warning you as a friend. There are forces at work here bigger than you understand. Powerful men in Denver who don't appreciate the kind of example you're setting. They're talking about sending territorial marshals, about investigating your fitness to hold federal land grants." The threat was clear and present. In the territories, land ownership was often dependent on federal approval, and that approval could be revoked for various reasons, including moral turpitude or conduct unbecoming a responsible citizen. Reed could lose everything he had worked for, everything he had built. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table, the weight of their situation pressed down on them like an approaching storm. Frank and Pete tried to maintain normal conversation, but the strain was showing on all of them. They were good men facing an impossible choice: stand by their principles and lose everything, or abandon Sarah to save themselves. Sarah finally broke the heavy silence. "I have brought this on you," she said quietly. "My presence here has made you enemies, threatened your livelihood, put you all in danger. I cannot continue to be the cause of such trouble." Reed looked across the table at her, seeing the pain in her dark eyes, the way she had withdrawn into herself as the pressure mounted. "Sarah, we've been through this. Running away won't solve anything, but staying will destroy everything you've worked for." "Maybe," Reed admitted, "but some things are more important than land or money or social standing. Sometimes a man has to decide what kind of person he wants to be, regardless of the cost." Frank nodded slowly. "Boss is right. We all knew this might get ugly when we took you in. Didn't change our minds then, doesn't change them now." Pete's young face was earnest as he looked at Sarah. "Miss Sarah, you've made this place feel like a real home instead of just a place to work. That's worth fighting for." But even as they spoke words of support and solidarity, Sarah could see the toll the pressure was taking. Frank's face was more drawn than usual, etched with worry about their uncertain future. Pete's youthful optimism was strained by the reality of social ostracism. And Reed himself, though outwardly calm, carried himself with the tension of a man preparing for war. The storm was gathering strength, and Sarah knew that the worst was yet to come. Mills had been only the opening shot in what promised to be a sustained campaign to destroy Reed's life and drive her away. The question was whether their small circle of loyalty could withstand the forces arrayed against them, or whether the pressure would eventually prove too much for even the strongest. Bonds to bear. The first Cherokee scout appeared on the ridgeline just after dawn on the third Tuesday of November, barely visible against the gray sky like a shadow given form. Sarah spotted him while drawing water from the well, her trained eyes catching movement where Reed and his men saw only empty landscape. Her heart lurched with a mixture of fear and desperate hope as she recognized the traditional hunting clothes, the way the figure sat his horse with the fluid grace of her people. She dropped the water bucket and ran toward the house, her feet flying over the frost-covered ground. Reed was in the kitchen preparing coffee when she burst through the door, her face flushed with excitement and something that might have been panic. "My people," she said breathlessly. "They have found me." Reed's hand stilled on the coffee pot. In the weeks since Sarah's arrival, he had sometimes wondered about her family, her tribe, whether anyone was searching for her. But she had spoken so little of her past that he had assumed she was alone in the world, cut off from whatever community might have once claimed her. "Where?" he asked quietly. Sarah pointed toward the eastern ridge. "One scout now. But if he is here, others are watching. They have been searching." Her voice carried a mixture of emotions Reed couldn't fully interpret: relief, anxiety, and something that might have been dread. Frank and Pete emerged from the bunkhouse, drawn by Sarah's unusual haste. Both men looked toward the ridge but saw nothing except trees and morning mist. Reed stepped outside and studied the landscape with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read the land for signs of danger. "I don't see anything," Frank said, squinting toward the eastern hills. "He is there," Sarah said with quiet certainty. "My brother's friend, Joseph Kingbird. I knew him as a child." She paused, her hands twisting together in a gesture Reed had learned to recognize as deep anxiety. He would not come alone. As if summoned by her words, more figures began to materialize along the ridgeline. Not many, perhaps 6 or 7. Riders, but their presence transformed the landscape from peaceful ranch country into something charged with potential danger. They made no move to approach, simply sat their horses in silent observation, like judges deliberating a verdict. Reed felt his stomach tighten with understanding. These were not random Cherokee passing through the territory. This was a deliberate mission, a purposeful arrival that had been planned and executed with military precision. The question was whether they had come to rescue Sarah or to extract justice for what had been done to her. "Sarah," Reed said carefully, "what exactly do they think happened to you?" She was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes fixed on the distant figures. When she spoke, her voice was heavy with implications. Reed was only beginning to understand. "When I did not return to the winter camp, when the snows came, and still I had not come home, they would have sent scouts to find me. If those scouts reached Millbrook, if they heard the stories—" She trailed off, but Reed could fill in the blanks. The Cherokee scouts would have heard about the beating, the public humiliation, the cutting of Sarah's hair. They would have learned that she had been taken in by a white rancher, but without understanding the context, such information could easily be misinterpreted. To her people, it might appear that Sarah had been captured, enslaved, or worse. "Do they know the truth?" Reed asked. "Do they understand that you're here by choice?" Sarah's expression was troubled. "I do not know what they have heard. Stories change as they travel, and my people have little reason to trust the word of white settlers." She looked at Reed with something approaching anguish. "They may believe you are holding me against my will." The implications of this misunderstanding settled over the ranch like a dark cloud. If the Cherokee believed Reed was Sarah's captor rather than her protector, they would act accordingly. And Cherokee justice, Reed knew, could be swift and final. Pete, who had been listening with a growing alarm, voiced what they were all thinking. "Boss, if they think you kidnapped Miss Sarah, they ain't gonna be interested in explanations." Frank nodded grimly. Cherokee don't take kindly to their women being mistreated. And after what happened in Millbrook, they got every reason to think the worst. Reed studied the figures on the ridge, counting their numbers and assessing their positioning. They had chosen their ground well, high enough to observe the entire valley, close enough to act quickly if necessary, but far enough away to avoid immediate confrontation. These were experienced warriors, not impulsive young men seeking glory. Sarah, Reed said, you need to go to them. You need to explain what really happened, make them understand that you're safe here. But Sarah shook her head, her face pale with an emotion Reed couldn't identify. It is not so simple. I have been gone for months, living among whites, adopting white ways. Some will say I have been corrupted, that I am no longer truly Cherokee. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. And there are other complications. What? Complications? Sarah was quiet for so long that Reed wondered if she would answer at all. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of secrets too long held. My brother, Daniel Whitehorse, was to lead our band before the winter sickness took him. With his death and my disappearance, the leadership fell to his friend, Robert Stormcrow. She paused, gathering courage for what came next. Before I left, to find food in the white settlements, Stormcrow had asked my father for permission to marry me. My father had agreed, believing it would strengthen our band's unity. Reed felt something cold settle in his stomach, and now Stormcrow believes he has been dishonored. If he thinks I have been living as a white man's woman, if he believes I have chosen this life over marriage to him. Sarah's voice trailed off, but the implications were clear. The Cherokee on the ridge weren't just potential rescuers or avengers. They were a delegation that included Sarah's intended husband, a man whose honor and authority had been called into question by her absence. The situation was far more complex and dangerous than Reed had initially understood. "Boss," Frank said. Quietly, maybe we should send up a white flag, try to parley. But before Reed could respond, one of the figures on the ridge began to move. A single rider separated from the group and started down the slope toward the ranch, moving at a steady walk that suggested confidence rather than aggression. As the rider drew closer, Sarah's breath caught in recognition. "Joseph Kingbird," she murmured. "He was my brother's closest friend. If anyone will listen to truth, it will be him." The approaching Cherokee was a man in his 30s, lean and weathered, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing as they swept over the ranch buildings and the small group of people watching his approach. He rode without weapons in his hands, but Reed could see a rifle in a scabbard and a knife at his belt. This was a warrior making a deliberate choice to appear peaceful while remaining ready for violence if necessary. Kingbird stopped his horse about 20 feet from where they stood, close enough for conversation but far enough to retreat quickly. If needed, his gaze moved over Reed, Frank, and Pete with careful assessment before settling on Sarah with an expression of profound relief mixed with concern. "Sister," he said in Cherokee, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. Sarah stepped forward, her chin lifted with dignity despite her obvious anxiety. "Brother," she replied in the same language, "you have traveled far to find me." "Your father's spirit cries out for justice," Kingbird said, switching to English so that Reed and his men could understand. "When you did not return to winter camp, when the snows came and still you had not come home, we feared the worst." "I am well," Sarah said simply. "I am safe." Kingbird's eyes moved to Reed, studying him with the intense scrutiny of a man trying to read character in a face he had never seen before. "Safe? Living among those who beat you, who cut your hair like a captured enemy. This is what you call safety?" Reed stepped forward slowly, his hands visible and empty. "She was beaten by others, not by me. I stopped the beating, brought her to safety, and helped her heal." "So you say," Kingbird replied, his tone neutral but watchful. "But white men's words often differ from white men's actions. Why should I believe you speak the truth?" It was Sarah who answered, "Because he risked his own safety to help me. Because he faced down the entire town of Millbrook to protect me. Because he has asked nothing of me except that I heal and be safe." Kingbird's expression softened slightly as he looked at Sarah, but uncertainty remained in his eyes. "Stormcrow says you have been corrupted by white ways, that you have forgotten your people and your duties. He says the woman who returns will not be the woman who left. Stormcrow fears for his pride more than my welfare, Sarah replied, and Reed heard steel in her voice that hadn't been there before. He worries that others will think him weak if his intended wife chooses her own path. And what path is that? Kingbird asked quietly. Sarah looked at Reed for a long moment, and in her eyes he saw a decision being made in real time. When she turned back to Kingbird, her voice was strong and clear. I choose to stay here with these people who have shown me kindness when my own people could not protect me. I choose to build a life where I am valued for who I am, not who I am promised to marry. The words hit Kingbird like physical blows. His face showed a mixture of shock, disappointment, and something that might have been understanding. Sarah, you speak of abandoning your blood, your heritage, your responsibilities to your people. I speak of choosing my own fate, Sarah replied. Firmly, my people could not keep me safe from the white settlers' violence. But this white man risked everything to protect me. Where is the honor in rejecting such kindness? Kingbird was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between Sarah and Reed, as if trying to read the true nature of their relationship. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of someone delivering a difficult message. I understand your words, sister, but Stormcrow will not. He has convinced many in our band that your honor and his have been stolen by whites. He speaks of war, of burning this ranch and everyone on it to wash away the shame. Reed felt his blood chill, but he kept his voice steady. How many warriors did he bring? 23 of our best fighters, Kingbird replied. More than enough to destroy this place and everyone in it. He paused, his eyes serious. But I did not come here for war. I came to understand the truth. And what is the truth? Reed asked. Kingbird looked at Sarah for a long moment before answering. The truth is that my sister speaks with her own voice, makes her own choices, and shows no signs of captivity or coercion. His gaze shifted to Reed. The truth is that you have indeed protected her, given her sanctuary when her own people could not. Will Stormcrow accept that truth? Sarah asked. Kingbird's expression was grim. Stormcrow's pride has been wounded, and wounded pride is dangerous in any man. He will demand satisfaction, one way or another. What kind of satisfaction? Reed asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Combat, Kingbird said simply. Single combat between him and the white man who has stolen his intended bride. To the death, as our traditions require. The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire. Reed understood that this was how Cherokee justice worked. Not through courts or juries, but through personal combat that left no room for appeal or interpretation. If he refused the challenge, he would be branded a coward, and Stormcrow would be free to attack the ranch with the full support of Cherokee law. When? Reed asked. Tomorrow at dawn, Kingbird replied. Stormcrow waits in the Sacred Grove 3 miles north of here. He expects you to come alone, armed only with blade and courage. Sarah stepped between the two men, her face pale but determined. No, I will not have good men die because of my choices. I will return with you, marry Stormcrow, fulfill my obligations. But Reed shook his head. Sarah, you said it yourself. You have the right to choose your own path. I won't let you sacrifice your freedom to save my life. And I won't let you sacrifice your life for my freedom, she replied fiercely. Kingbird watched the exchange with growing understanding. These two people genuinely cared for each other, were willing to make profound sacrifices for the other's welfare. This was not a white man holding a Cherokee woman against her will, but something much more complex and far more real. There may be another way, Kingbird said slowly. Our traditions speak of trial by combat, but they also speak of trial by wisdom. If Stormcrow can be convinced that his challenge is unjust, that his honor does not require blood. How? Sarah asked. The elders must be consulted. Old woman Sunflower still lives, still speaks with the voice of tradition. If she can be brought to hear your story, to understand what truly happened, she might rule that no combat is necessary. Reed felt a flicker of hope. Will Stormcrow accept the judgment of the elders? He will have to, Kingbird replied. Cherokee law is clear. The elders' wisdom supersedes individual pride. But bringing Sunflower here, convincing her to hear your case, that will not be easy. I'll go to her, Sarah said immediately. I'll explain everything, make her understand. Kingbird shook his head. You cannot return to the camp, sister. Stormcrow has declared you corrupted, forbidden any from speaking with you until the matter is settled, but perhaps. He paused, an idea forming behind his dark eyes. Perhaps if the white man came himself, if he spoke truth before the elders, showed them the kind of man he truly is. Reed understood immediately. You want me to come to your camp, face Stormcrow and the elders, argue my case before a Cherokee tribunal. It is dangerous, Kingbird admitted. Many of our warriors have suffered at white hands. They will not welcome you, and some may seek to kill you before you can speak. But if I don't go, if I don't try to make them understand, then tomorrow I face Stormcrow in single combat and probably die anyway. Yes, Kingbird said simply. Reed looked at Sarah, seeing the fear in her eyes, the desperate hope that somehow this situation could be resolved without bloodshed. He thought about Frank and Pete, good men who had stood by him despite the growing danger. He thought about his ranch, his cattle, everything he had built in this valley, but mostly he thought about Sarah, her courage, her dignity, the way she had brought light and purpose to his previously solitary life. If there was any chance of protecting her freedom, of giving her the life she deserved, he had to take it. When do we leave? Reed asked. Kingbird's face showed approval and perhaps a touch of admiration. Now, the Council of Elders convenes at sunset, and your words must be heard before the darkness falls and tradition demands blood. As Reed prepared for what might be his final journey, Sarah caught his hand in hers. Marcus, you don't have to do this. You could leave, ride west, start over somewhere else. Reed looked into her dark eyes and saw everything he had been searching for his entire life without knowing it. Sarah, running away would mean losing you. And losing you would mean losing the best part of myself. The words were simple, honest, and they carried the weight of a man who had finally discovered what was worth fighting for. As Reed mounted his horse to ride toward an uncertain fate, he carried with him not just hope for survival, but the knowledge that some things were more precious than life itself. The Cherokee camp materialized from the forest like something from a half-remembered dream. Traditional hide lodges arranged in a careful circle around a central fire that had burned continuously for generations. Smoke rose straight up in the still air, carrying the scent of burning cedar and sage that spoke of ceremonies and solemn councils. Reed had never seen a Cherokee settlement before, and despite the danger of his situation, he found himself struck by the harmony between the camp and the natural landscape that surrounded it. Joseph, Kingbird led Reed through the camp's outer perimeter, past warriors who watched their approach with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Word of the white man's arrival had traveled quickly, and people emerged from their lodges to stare at the rancher, who had dared to enter their territory to claim one of their women. Reed kept his eyes forward and his hands visible, understanding that any sudden movement might be interpreted as aggression. He had left his rifle with Kingbird before entering the camp, carrying only a hunting knife, as was traditional for formal Cherokee councils. The blade felt inadequate given the hostile stares that followed his progress, but Reed knew that his real weapons here would be words and whatever courage he could muster. At the camp's center, near the sacred fire, a group of Cherokee elders sat in council formation. Reed counted 8 of them, men and women whose faces showed the weathering of many seasons and whose eyes held the accumulated wisdom of a people who had survived conquest. displacement, and constant pressure to abandon their traditional ways. At their head sat an ancient woman whose presence seemed to command the very air around her. Old Woman Sunflower was smaller than Reed had expected, her back bent with age and her hair white as fresh snow. But her eyes were sharp as obsidian, and when she looked at Reed, he felt as though she could see straight through to his soul. She wore traditional Cherokee dress, beaded and decorated with symbols that spoke of her status as a keeper of the old ways. To her right sat Robert Stormcrow, and Reed understood immediately why Sarah had been reluctant to return to her people. Stormcrow was a powerful man in his prime, broad-shouldered and radiating the kind of controlled violence that marked experienced warriors. His face was painted with red and black stripes that transformed his features into a mask of vengeance, and his dark eyes burned with fury that had been building for months. Kingbird stopped at the edge of the circle and spoke in Cherokee, his words formal and respectful. Reed caught only fragments of meaning, but he understood that he was being presented to the council as the white man who had sheltered Sarah Whitehorse. The elders' faces revealed nothing as they studied this unexpected visitor who had willingly placed himself in their power. Old Woman Sunflower raised her hand for silence, and the murmur of conversation that had filled the camp died away instantly. When she spoke, her voice was surprisingly strong for someone of her advanced age, carrying clearly across the circle. "Marcus Reed," she said in accented but clear English, "you have come to our fire to speak of Sarah Whitehorse, daughter of our people, woman promised to Robert Stormcrow. What words do you bring to this council?" Reed stepped forward slowly, understanding that this moment would determine not only his own fate, but Sarah's future as well. He had rehearsed what he might say during the ride to the camp, but now, facing the assembled elders and feeling the weight of Cherokee tradition pressing down on him, his prepared words seemed inadequate. "Honored elders," he began, his voice steady despite the tension that coiled in his stomach. "I come to speak truth about what happened to Sarah Whitehorse in the white settlement called Millbrook." Stormcrow's voice cut across the circle like a blade. "Truth? What truth can come from the mouth of a white man who steals Cherokee women? What truth from one who corrupts our daughters with false promises and foreign ways?" Old Woman Sunflower's sharp gaze silenced Stormcrow with a look that could have frozen fire. "The council will hear all words before judgment is spoken. Continue, white man." Reed took a breath and began to tell the story of that October morning when he had first encountered Sarah in Millbrook streets. He described the crowd, the bloodied knife in Thomas Garrison's hand, the way Sarah had knelt in the dirt with her hair shorn and her dignity intact, despite the cruelty she had endured. As he spoke, Reed could see the elders' faces change. Several showed surprise at his description of the violence Sarah had suffered. Others revealed anger at the treatment she had received from the white settlers. But it was Old Woman Sunflower's expression that mattered most, and her ancient features showed nothing but careful attention as she weighed his words against whatever other information she possessed. "You say you protected her," said one of the male elders, a man whose scarred hands spoke of many battles. "But protection can take many forms. Some would call taking a woman into your home protection. Others would call it capture. I offered her sanctuary," Reed replied carefully. "A place to heal, food to eat, safety from those who would harm her further. She was free to leave at any time, free to make her own choices about her future." Stormcrow's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Free? A Cherokee woman alone among whites, injured and far from her people. What freedom is that? You speak of choice, but what choice did she have except to submit to your will? She chose to stay," Reed said simply. "Not because she had no other options, but because she found peace in my home. Because she was treated with respect, valued for her intelligence and strength, not just seen as property to be owned." The word property hit the circle like a stone thrown into still water. Several of the elders shifted uncomfortably, understanding the implication. Cherokee women had traditionally held considerable autonomy and respect within their society, but the pressures of displacement and cultural survival had sometimes led to more rigid interpretations of women's roles. Old woman Sunflower leaned forward slightly, her obsidian eyes fixed on Reed with unsettling intensity. "You speak of respect and choice, white man. But Sarah Whitehorse was promised to Robert Stormcrow by her father before the winter sickness took him. This promise was made according to our customs, witnessed by the elders, blessed by the spirits. Do you understand what you ask us to set aside?" Reed felt the weight of Cherokee tradition bearing down on him, generations of customs and obligations that governed how their society functioned. But he also thought of Sarah's face when she had spoken of choosing her own path, the strength and determination in her voice when she declared her independence. "I understand that promises were made," Reed said carefully. "But they were made without Sarah's consent, made for her rather than by her. And circumstances have changed since those promises were spoken." "How have they changed?" demanded Stormcrow, his painted face fierce in the firelight. Reed looked directly at the Cherokee warrior, meeting his angry gaze without flinching. "Sarah has seen another way of living. She has experienced what it means to be valued as an individual rather than as an obligation. She has tasted freedom, and having tasted it, she cannot pretend it doesn't exist." "Freedom?" Stormcrow's voice rose with indignation. "What freedom is there in abandoning her people, her heritage, her duties? What freedom is there in becoming a white man's woman, in turning her back on everything that makes her Cherokee?" "The freedom to choose her own happiness," Reed replied. "The freedom to decide what gives her life meaning. The freedom to be more than just a wife and mother if that's what she desires." An uncomfortable silence fell over the council. Reed's words challenged fundamental assumptions about how Cherokee society should function, about the roles of men and women, about the balance between individual desires and collective obligations. Several of the elders looked troubled, while others seemed offended by the implications of what he was suggesting. It was old woman Sunflower who broke the silence, her ancient voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen the world change many times and understood the necessity of adaptation. "White man, you speak of Sarah Whitehorse as though she were present to speak for herself, but she is not here. We have only your words about what she wants, what she chooses. How do we know you do not put your own desires into her mouth?" The question was fair and penetrating, cutting to the heart of the matter. Reed understood that his testimony alone was insufficient, that the elders needed to hear from Sarah herself if they were to make a just decision. But Sarah had been forbidden from returning to the camp, declared corrupted by Stormcrow's authority. "Then let her speak," Reed said simply. "Bring her here, let her stand before this council and declare her own mind. Let the elders hear her words, judge her choices for themselves." Stormcrow was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the tomahawk at his belt. "No, she has been tainted by white influence, corrupted by foreign ways. Her words cannot be trusted." "If her words cannot be trusted," Reed said quietly, "then how can any of us claim to know what she truly wants?" The logic was unassailable, and even Stormcrow seemed to recognize its force. He stood in the firelight, chest heaving with frustrated rage, torn between his desire for vengeance and the requirements of Cherokee justice. Old woman Sunflower raised her hand again, and slowly, reluctantly, Stormcrow resumed his seat. The ancient woman's eyes moved around the circle of elders, reading their faces, gauging their thoughts. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of final authority. "The council will hear from Sarah Whitehorse," she announced. "She will be brought here under the protection of the elders, free to speak her mind without fear or coercion. Her words will be weighed against the customs of our people, and judgment will be rendered according to what is just." Stormcrow's face twisted with anger, but he didn't dare oppose a direct ruling from old woman Sunflower. Instead, he turned his fury on Reed, his painted features demonic in the dancing firelight. "And what of you, white man?" Stormcrow snarled. "If Sarah chooses to honor her obligations, if she returns to our people as she should, what then? Do you think you can simply walk away from this council, return to your ranch as if nothing has happened?" Reed had been dreading this moment, knowing that his presence in the Cherokee camp was itself a challenge that couldn't be ignored. Even if Sarah chose to return to her people, even if the council ruled against him, Stormcrow's honor would still demand satisfaction. "I accept whatever judgment the council renders," Reed said carefully. "I came here to speak truth, not to force any outcome." "Truth," Stormcrow repeated mockingly. "You came here because you knew that tomorrow at dawn you would face my blade. In single combat. You came here hoping these old ones would save you from the consequences of your theft." The accusation stung because it contained an element of truth. Reed had indeed come to the council partly to avoid the certainty of death that awaited him in single combat with a Cherokee warrior. But his primary motivation had been to ensure that Sarah's voice was heard, that her choices were respected. "If the council rules that combat is necessary," Reed said quietly, "then I will face you at dawn as tradition requires. I will not hide behind the elders' protection if they judge that honor demands blood." Old Woman Sunflower studied Reed with those sharp obsidian eyes, seeming to weigh not just his words but his character. When she spoke, her voice carried a note of approval that surprised several of the council members. "You show courage, white man. Foolish courage, perhaps, but courage nonetheless. It has been many seasons since a white man entered our camp to speak for one of our women." She paused, her ancient face thoughtful. "But courage alone does not determine justice. We must hear from Sarah Whitehorse before any final judgment can be rendered." Kingbird stepped forward from where he had been standing at the edge of the circle. "Honored grandmother, I will ride to bring Sarah here. With your permission, I will guarantee her safety and her freedom to speak without constraint." Old Woman Sunflower nodded slowly. "Let it be so. But know this, if Sarah Whitehorse chooses to honor her obligations to our people, if she accepts her role as Robert Stormcrow's wife, then the white man's fate is sealed. Combat will determine whether his interference in our affairs demands blood payment. And if she chooses otherwise?" Reed asked. The ancient woman's smile was enigmatic, holding secrets that had accumulated over decades of seeing human nature in all its complexity. "Then we will discover whether our traditions are strong enough to bend without breaking," she said. "Whether the Cherokee people can honor individual choice while preserving collective identity." As Kingbird prepared to ride back to Reed's ranch to fetch Sarah, the council began to disperse for the evening meal. Reed found himself assigned to a lodge under guard, not imprisonment exactly, but careful supervision that ensured he wouldn't disappear into the night. The Cherokee warriors who watched him were polite but alert, understanding that their prisoner represented a significant challenge to their traditional ways. As Reed lay on the sleeping furs provided for him, staring up at the lodge's smoke hole, where stars wheeled overhead, he thought about the impossible situation he had created. By protecting Sarah, by offering her sanctuary and respect, he had challenged not just individual prejudices, but entire systems of belief about race, culture, and the proper roles of men and women. Tomorrow, Sarah would stand before the Cherokee Council and declare her choice. And depending on what she said, Reed would either ride home to his ranch as a free man, or face Robert Stormcrow in combat with the near certainty of death. But as he listened to the night sounds of the Cherokee camp, the murmur of conversation around distant fires, the soft singing of women preparing for sleep, the occasional cry of a night bird, Reed felt a strange peace settle over him. He had done what he believed was right, had stood up for principles that mattered more than his own safety. Whatever happened tomorrow, he would face it knowing that he had tried to protect something precious and rare, a woman's right to choose her own destiny in a world that preferred to make such choices for her. And if that conviction cost him his life, at least it would be a death that carried meaning. Sarah arrived at the Cherokee camp as the sun reached its zenith, riding behind Joseph Kingbird with the bearing of a woman who had made peace with whatever fate awaited her. She wore a simple dress of deep blue wool that Reed had bought for her in town, her hair now grown long enough to braid properly with the ribbon he had given her. The combination of Cherokee features and white clothing created a visual symbol of the cultural boundaries she had crossed, the world she now moved between with quiet confidence. The camp fell silent as she passed through the outer circle of lodges. Children peered out from behind their mothers' skirts. Warriors studied her with expressions ranging from curiosity to disapproval, and elders watched with the careful attention of those who understood they were witnessing a moment that would define the future of their people's relationship with the changing world. Sarah's eyes found Reed among the group of men near the central fire, and something passed between them in that glance, not just affection, but recognition of shared purpose and mutual respect. Reed saw in her face the same quiet strength that had first attracted his admiration in Millbrook streets, but now tempered by months of healing and the confidence that came from being valued for who she was rather than what others expected her to be. Old woman Sunflower rose from her seat as Sarah approached the council circle, her ancient frame moving with surprising grace. The two women faced each other across generations of Cherokee history, the keeper of old ways and the young woman who represented new possibilities. Sarah Whitehorse, the elder said formally, daughter of our people, you have been called before this council to speak truth about your choices and your heart. Do you come here freely, without coercion or fear? I come freely, grandmother, Sarah replied, using the respectful term for female elders. Her voice carried clearly across the circle, steady and strong. I come to speak for myself, as Cherokee law permits. Robert Stormcrow shifted restlessly in his seat, his painted face a mask of barely controlled anger. The months of wounded pride and public humiliation had transformed his original attraction to Sarah into something darker, more possessive. He had convinced himself that his honor depended on claiming her, regardless of her own desires. Sarah Whitehorse, old woman Sunflower continued, you were promised in marriage to Robert Stormcrow by your father before the winter sickness took him. This promise was made according to our customs, witnessed by elders, blessed by the spirits. Do you acknowledge this obligation? Sarah looked directly at Stormcrow, meeting his furious gaze without flinching. I acknowledge that such a promise was made, but I was not consulted about it, did not consent to it, and circumstances have changed since it was spoken. Murmurs rippled through the assembled Cherokee, some expressing shock at her boldness, others showing approval for her courage. The question of women's autonomy in marriage arrangements had been growing within Cherokee society as they struggled to maintain their identity while adapting to an increasingly hostile world. Stormcrow rose to his feet, his hand moving instinctively toward his tomahawk. Changed? How have circumstances changed, except that you have been corrupted by white ways, turned against your own people by a white man's lies? I have learned that there are different ways to live, Sarah replied calmly. I have discovered that a woman can be valued for her mind as well as her body, respected for her choices as well as her obligations. I have experienced kindness without expectation, protection without possession. Lies, Stormcrow's voice cracked with emotion. White men speak of respect while they steal our lands, promise kindness while they drive us from our homes. You have been deceived by smooth words and false promises. Sarah's response was quiet, but devastating in its sincerity. The white man who protects me asked for nothing in return. He offered me sanctuary when my own people could not keep me safe. He gave me shelter, food, and medical care without demanding payment or submission. He treated me as a human being worthy of respect, not as property to be claimed. The words struck the council like lightning. illuminating uncomfortable truths about the Cherokees' inability to protect their own people from white violence. Several elders looked away, unable to meet Sarah's steady gaze as she spoke of their collective failure. Old woman Sunflower raised her hand for silence, her sharp eyes moving between Sarah and Stormcrow. "You speak harsh words, granddaughter. Do you reject all Cherokee ways, all the customs that have sustained our people for generations?" "No, grandmother," Sarah replied, her voice softening with genuine respect. "I cherish many Cherokee ways, our connection to the land, our respect for the wisdom of elders, our understanding that all life is sacred. But I cannot accept that. Being Cherokee means surrendering my right to choose my own path. And what path do you choose?" the ancient woman asked. Sarah looked around the circle of elders, then at the assembled Cherokee, watching from beyond the formal council space. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of a decision that had been building for months. "I choose to live between worlds. I choose to honor my Cherokee heritage while embracing new ways of being. I choose to marry for love rather than obligation, to build a life based on mutual respect rather than traditional roles." Her gaze found Reed among the watchers. "And I choose Marcus Reed as my husband, if he will have me." The declaration sent shockwaves through the Cherokee camp. Some voices rose in outrage, others in support. Children pressed closer to better. See the woman who dared to challenge their most fundamental customs. Warriors fingered their weapons, uncertain whether they were witnessing courage or blasphemy. Stormcrow's reaction was immediate and violent. He drew his tomahawk and took a step toward Sarah, his painted face twisted with rage. "You dare speak such words before the sacred fire? You dare reject your obligations to your people for the empty promises of a white man?" But before he could advance further, old woman Sunflower's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Hold!" The single word carried such authority that Stormcrow froze in place, his weapon half raised. "No blood will be shed in the council circle. That is our law, older than your pride." Reed started to move toward Sarah, instinctively wanting to protect her, but Joseph Kingbird caught his arm. "Wait," Kingbird whispered. "This is her moment. Let her finish what she started." Sarah stepped toward Stormcrow, close enough that he could have struck her down with a single blow. But instead of showing fear, she showed compassion, speaking to him as one human being to another. "Robert, I know my words cause you pain. I know they challenge your understanding of honor and duty. But would you truly want a wife who came to your lodge only from obligation? Would you build your happiness on another's surrender?" For a moment, something flickered in Stormcrow's eyes, perhaps recognition of the truth in her words, perhaps simply exhaustion from carrying his rage for so long. But then his face hardened again, and he turned away from her to address the council. "This woman has been poisoned against her own people," he declared. "She speaks with a white man's voice, thinks with a white man's mind. She is lost to us, no longer truly Cherokee." He pointed his tomahawk toward Reed, "And the white man who corrupted her must pay the price. I demand satisfaction according to our ancient ways, single combat to the death." Old woman Sunflower was quiet for a long moment, her ancient mind weighing traditions against justice, custom against compassion. When she finally spoke, her words carried the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime spent navigating the complexities of human nature. "Robert Stormcrow, your pain is real, your anger understandable. You feel that your honor has been wounded, your rightful place taken by an outsider. But hear the words of an old woman who has seen many seasons pass, many changes come to our people." She gestured toward Sarah with one gnarled hand. "This young woman speaks truth when she says our people could not protect her from white violence. We have grown weak, scattered, unable to shield our children from the hatred that surrounds us. When one of our own finds safety and happiness, even with a white man, should we not rejoice rather than condemn?" "She abandons her heritage," Stormcrow protested. does she? Old Woman Sunflower asked quietly. Or does she expand it? Does she make it stronger by showing that Cherokee values, courage, honesty, loyalty, can flourish in any soil? The elder's words created ripples of thoughtful silence through the assembled Cherokee. Some nodded slowly, beginning to see the situation from a different perspective. Others remained unconvinced, their faces set in stubborn opposition to change. Old Woman Sunflower turned to Reed, her obsidian eyes studying him with penetrating intensity. White man, you have heard Sarah Whitehorse declare her choice. You have seen the pain your protection of her has caused among her people. Do you still claim her? Do you still seek to take her from us? Reed stepped forward into the council circle, understanding that this was his moment to speak not just for himself, but for the possibility of building bridges between divided worlds. Honored elders, he began, I don't seek to take Sarah from you. I seek to love her, to build a life with her that honors both Cherokee wisdom and the possibilities of the future. If she will have me, I will be proud to learn from her people, to serve as a bridge between our communities rather than a source of division. Pretty words, Stormcrow sneered, but words are easy. Will you prove your sincerity with your blood? Will you face me in combat as honor demands? Reed looked at the Cherokee warrior, seeing the pain beneath the rage, the desperate need to salvage something from a situation that had spiraled beyond his control. If the council rules that combat is necessary, I will face you. But I would rather find a way for both of us to live with honor. Old Woman Sunflower smiled, the expression transforming her ancient features. Wisdom speaks through young voices as well as old ones, she said approvingly. Then she addressed the full council, her voice carrying the authority of final judgment. This council has heard all voices, weighed all arguments. Sarah Whitehorse has spoken her choice freely, without coercion. Marcus Reed has shown respect for our people and our customs. Robert Stormcrow's pain is acknowledged, but pain does not justify violence against the innocent. She paused, letting her words settle before continuing. Therefore, this council rules that no combat is required. Sarah Whitehorse is free to choose her own path, whether it leads back to our people or forward into the white world. Her Cherokee blood cannot be taken from her, no matter where her heart leads. Stormcrow's face went white, then red with fury. You cannot simply set aside our customs. You cannot let a white man steal a Cherokee woman without consequences. I do not set aside our customs, Old Woman Sunflower replied firmly. I apply them. Cherokee law has always recognized that forced marriage brings misery to all parties. Cherokee wisdom has always valued individual choice, alongside collective responsibility. She rose to her full height, small but commanding. Robert Stormcrow, your pride has been wounded, but your honor remains intact. Seek a wife who chooses you freely, who comes to your lodge with joy rather than resignation. Build your happiness on mutual affection rather than obligation. The ruling was final, backed by the full authority of Cherokee tradition and the wisdom of the elders. Stormcrow stood frozen for a moment, his painted face a mask of conflicting emotions. Then, without another word, he turned and stalked away. From the council circle, his supporters following in his wake, Sarah stepped toward Reed, her eyes bright with unshed tears of relief and joy. When he opened his arms, she came to him without hesitation, and their embrace was witnessed by the entire Cherokee Council as a symbol of love, transcending the boundaries that divided their worlds. Old Woman Sunflower approached the couple, her ancient hands carrying a leather pouch decorated with traditional beadwork. Sarah Whitehorse, you have chosen to walk between worlds. Take this with you, herbs from our sacred mountains, seeds from our ancestral gardens. Plant them in your new home, tend them with Cherokee wisdom, and remember that you carry our blood wherever you go. Sarah accepted the gift with trembling hands, understanding its significance. She was being given permission not just to leave, but to take part of her heritage with her, to maintain her connection to Cherokee culture, even as she built a new life among whites. The journey back to Reed's ranch took place in contemplative silence, both Sarah and Reed processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. They had faced down not just individual opposition, but the weight of centuries of tradition, and they had emerged victorious through courage, honesty, and the support of wisdom that recognized the necessity of change. As they crested the final ridge and looked down into the Copper Valley, Sarah felt a profound sense of homecoming. The ranch buildings looked small and peaceful in the afternoon light, smoke rising from the chimney where Frank had kept the fires burning. Cattle grazed in the distance, and everything spoke of stability, hard work, and the possibility of building something lasting. "Are you sure about this?" Reed asked quietly. "There's no going back once you marry a white man. Your people may never fully accept the choice." Sarah looked at him with eyes that held no doubt, no regret, only quiet determination. "I have already made my choice. Everything else is just details." That evening, as they sat by the fire in Reed's main room with Frank and Pete sharing dinner and conversation, Sarah began to speak of her plans for their future together. She wanted to plant the Cherokee seeds Old Woman Sunflower had given her, to create a garden that would honor her heritage while feeding their new family. She spoke of teaching Reed Cherokee words and customs, of building bridges between their communities that might someday heal the wounds created by fear and misunderstanding. Frank raised his coffee cup in a toast to new beginnings and old wisdom. He said solemnly. Pete nodded enthusiastically. "And to Miss Sarah, who's got more courage than the rest of us put together." Reed looked around the table at these people who had become his family. Sarah with her quiet strength and vision for the future, Frank with his weathered loyalty and practical wisdom, Pete with his youthful enthusiasm and generous heart. Outside, the first snows of winter were beginning to fall, but inside, the fire burned warm and bright, illuminating faces filled with hope and determination. As the months passed and spring returned to the Copper Valley, the changes Sarah had envisioned began to take root. Her Cherokee garden flourished alongside Reed's practical crops, creating a visual symbol of two cultures learning to grow together. Word of their marriage spread slowly through both white and Cherokee communities, challenging assumptions and occasionally opening minds. Some relationships were lost. Preacher Mills continued his campaign of moral outrage, and several neighboring ranchers maintained their disapproval. But other connections deepened, as people like Dr. Ashford and young Timothy Morrison came to see Sarah as an individual rather than a representative of racial fears. The Cherokee camp moved on with the seasons, following the ancient patterns that had sustained them through centuries of change. But Joseph Kingbird visited occasionally, bringing news of Sarah's people and maintaining the connection between worlds that she had worked so hard to preserve. On a warm evening in late spring, as Sarah and Reed sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, she placed his hand on her growing belly and smiled. "Our child will know both worlds," she said softly. "Cherokee wisdom and white determination, traditional ways and new possibilities." Reed felt the flutter of movement beneath his palm and marveled at the miracle of life they had created together. "What do you think the future holds for children like ours?" Sarah's eyes were distant, seeing possibilities that existed beyond the horizon of current understanding. "I think they will help heal the wounds between our peoples. I think they will show both sides that we are more alike than different, that love is stronger than fear." As night fell over the Copper Valley, the last light reflecting off the windows of their home like beacons calling travelers toward safety, Sarah and Reed understood that they had become more than just husband and wife. They had become pioneers of a different sort, exploring not new territories, but new ways of being human together. The story that had begun with violence and hatred in Millbrook streets had transformed into something entirely different. A tale of love conquering fear, of individual courage challenging collective prejudice, of two people choosing to build bridges where others saw only walls, and in the growing darkness, with stars beginning to emerge overhead like ancient promises of hope, their home stood as proof that sometimes the most radical act is simply treating another human being with dignity and respect, regardless of the color of their skin or the culture of their birth. 5 years after that first October morning in Millbrook, the Copper Valley Ranch had become something unprecedented in the American frontier, a place where Cherokee and white traditions intertwined like the morning glory vines that Sarah had trained to grow up the porch posts. The ranch house itself bore witness to this cultural fusion, with traditional Cherokee symbols carved into the doorframe alongside Reed's practical improvements, creating a visual testament to the possibility of harmony between different worlds. Dr. William Ashford dismounted from his buggy on a crisp autumn morning, his medical bag in one hand and a leather satchel of mail in the other. His monthly visits to the ranch had evolved from professional obligations into genuine friendship, and he looked forward to these journeys into the valley where prejudice had been replaced by understanding. Sarah's in the garden, Frank Dalton called from the barn, where he was training a new colt with the patience that had made him invaluable to the ranch's success. The little ones are helping her harvest the winter squash. Ashford smiled at the mention of the children. Sarah and Reed's son Daniel was now 3 years old, a sturdy boy with his mother's dark eyes and his father's quiet confidence. Their daughter Mary had arrived just 8 months ago and already showed signs of the intelligence that marked both her parents. The children were growing up bilingual, equally comfortable with Cherokee lullabies and English nursery rhymes, representing a future that transcended the divisions that had nearly destroyed their parents' chance at happiness. The doctor found Sarah kneeling among the raised beds where Cherokee Three Sisters corn, beans, and squash grew alongside European vegetables in a harmony that mirrored the cultural integration of the ranch itself. Young Daniel sat beside her, his small hands carefully placing acorn, squash into a wicker basket while chattering in the mixture of Cherokee and English that had become the household's natural language. "Dr. Ashford," Daniel called out, abandoning his harvest duties to run toward their visitor with the uninhibited joy of a child who had never learned to fear anyone based on their appearance or background. Sarah rose gracefully, despite the slight awkwardness that came from carrying Mary in a traditional Cherokee cradleboard on her back. The years had only enhanced her natural beauty, adding the confidence of a woman who had found her place in the world and the contentment of someone whose choices had proven wise. "William, what news from town?" she asked, settling the cradleboard more comfortably as Mary gurgled happily in the morning air. Ashford's expression grew serious as he handed her several letters. "Mixed news, I'm afraid. The territorial legislature is debating new laws regarding Indian land rights, and there's talk of forcing all Cherokee to relocate to the Indian Territory in Oklahoma." Sarah's face tightened with concern. Despite her choice to live among whites, she maintained strong connections to her people and regularly sent supplies and medicine to Cherokee communities struggling to maintain their independence. The threat of forced relocation hung over every Native American family like a sword waiting to fall. "What does Joseph say in his letters?" Sarah asked, recognizing Kingbird's distinctive handwriting on one of the envelopes. "I haven't read them, of course, but his face was grim when he delivered them to my office. The federal government is increasing pressure on all tribes to accept relocation. They're using economic warfare, cutting off trade, preventing access to traditional hunting grounds, making it impossible to maintain traditional ways of life." Reed emerged from the house at that moment, his sleeves rolled up from working on the ranch's account books. The success of the Copper Valley Ranch had surprised even Reed himself. Sarah's knowledge of native plants and traditional farming methods had increased their crop yields significantly, while her connections to Cherokee communities had opened new trading opportunities that benefited everyone involved. Any word from the territorial capital? Reed asked, joining the small group in the garden. Ashford nodded grimly. Governor Crawford is under pressure from Washington to show results in civilizing the frontier. That seems to include breaking up any cooperation between white settlers and Native Americans. There are rumors of new regulations that would prohibit intermarriage and require the registration of all mixed children. The threat was real and personal. Daniel and Mary represented everything the authorities feared, proof that racial boundaries could be crossed without catastrophe, that children could inherit the best of both cultures and grow up free from the hatred that divided their parents' generation. Sarah unconsciously pulled Daniel closer to her side. They want to eliminate evidence that cooperation is possible. If our children succeed, if they show that mixing cultures creates strength rather than weakness, it challenges everything the government claims about racial superiority. Pete Hawkins approached from the corral, now a full partner in the ranch operation and married to Ellen Morrison, Timothy's older sister. Their own wedding had caused scandal in Millbrook, not because of racial differences, but because Pete had insisted on including Cherokee blessing ceremonies alongside the Christian service, another small victory for cultural understanding. "Riders coming up the valley road," Pete announced. 3 of them, riding hard. Reed's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle he still kept close at hand. 5 years of peace hadn't erased the memory of past threats, and unknown riders still triggered caution among the ranch's inhabitants. But as the riders drew closer, Sarah's tension eased. "Cherokee," she said with relief. "I recognize the lead horse. It belongs to my cousin, Samuel Ridge." The 3 Cherokee riders approached at a gallop, their faces grim with urgent news. Samuel Ridge was a man in his 40s, a leader among those Cherokee who had refused to accept relocation and continued to fight for their rights through legal and political channels. His presence at the ranch meant serious developments in the ongoing struggle for Cherokee survival. "Sarah Marcus," Samuel called out as he dismounted, "we need your help. Federal marshals are moving against the remaining Cherokee communities. They're seizing property, arresting leaders, forcing families onto wagon trains bound for Oklahoma." The words hit the assembled group like physical blows. Despite the legal protections supposedly afforded to all American citizens, Cherokee families were being treated as enemy combatants in their own homeland. "How many have been taken?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "Hundreds already, with more raids planned. But we've established a network of safe houses, hidden camps where families can shelter until the worst of this passes. We need supplies, medical equipment, and safe passage through white settlements." Reed didn't hesitate. "What do you need from us?" Samuel looked around the group, seeing allies where Cherokee had traditionally found only enemies. Medicine, food, warm clothing for children. And if possible, documents that would allow Cherokee families to travel through white areas without being arrested as fugitives. Dr. Ashford stepped forward. "I can provide medical supplies and signed papers stating that I'm treating Cherokee patients at various locations. That should give families some protection from legal harassment." Pete nodded enthusiastically. "Ellen's father has connections with other store owners who aren't happy with the government's heavy-handed tactics. We might be able to organize a supply network." But it was Sarah who grasped the larger implications. "This isn't just about saving Cherokee families from immediate danger. This is about preserving our culture, our knowledge, our connection to this land. If we're all forced onto reservations in Oklahoma, if we're cut off from our ancestral territories, something vital will be lost forever." Reed placed his hand on her shoulder, understanding the weight of what she was saying. "Then we don't let that happen. We use this ranch as a center for preserving Cherokee knowledge, for maintaining connections between scattered communities." Over the following months, the Copper Valley Ranch became the heart of an underground network that helped Cherokee families evade forced relocation while working to preserve their cultural heritage. Sarah began transcribing traditional songs, stories, and medicinal knowledge, creating written records that could survive even if the communities that created them were scattered. Frank proved surprisingly adept at organizing supply runs to hidden Cherokee camps, his weathered face and taciturn manner allowing him to travel through hostile territory without arousing suspicion. Pete used his connections in Millbrook to gather intelligence about federal operations and early warnings of planned raids. Dr. Ashford established a system of medical clinics that provided legitimate cover for Cherokee families to gather and share information. His reputation for professional competence protected him from official scrutiny, while his genuine commitment to helping all patients, regardless of race, earned him allies among both white and Cherokee communities. The work was dangerous and emotionally exhausting. Several times, federal marshals came close to discovering the network's existence. Twice, Cherokee families had to flee their temporary shelters just hours ahead of government raids. The constant tension of living under threat of discovery took its toll on everyone involved, but there were victories as well. Dozens of Cherokee families found safety through the network's efforts. Traditional knowledge was preserved that might otherwise have been lost. Children who might have been separated from their families in government schools were kept with their parents and taught their ancestral language and customs. Most importantly, the network demonstrated that cooperation between races was not only possible but beneficial to everyone involved. White families who initially joined out of simple human decency discovered that Cherokee knowledge of agriculture, medicine, and sustainable living practices could improve their own lives significantly. On a snowy evening in late December, as Sarah sat by the fire teaching Daniel traditional Cherokee counting songs, while Mary slept peacefully in her arms, Reed reflected on how far they had all traveled from that brutal morning in Millbrook streets. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, quietly. "Choosing this life, taking on all these responsibilities?" Sarah looked up from the primer she was creating, a book that would teach Cherokee children to read in both their native language and English. Her dark eyes held no doubt, no regret, only the deep satisfaction of someone who had found purpose beyond personal happiness. "Never," she said simply. "We're not just saving individual families, Marcus. We're proving that the future doesn't have to repeat the mistakes of the past. Our children will grow up in a world where Cherokee and white aren't an impossible combination, where cultural mixing creates strength rather than conflict." Reed nodded, understanding that their personal love story had become something larger, a template for how different peoples could live together with mutual respect and benefit. The ranch had become a symbol of possibility, proof that the American frontier could be a place of cooperation rather than conquest. As 1855 dawned, bringing new challenges and new opportunities, the Copper Valley Ranch stood as a beacon of hope in a landscape too often marked by hatred and division. The children playing in its yard, the gardens growing traditional Cherokee plants alongside European crops, the adults working together regardless of racial background, all testified to the radical idea that human dignity transcended the artificial boundaries that divided communities. The story that had begun with one man's simple act of decency in protecting a vulnerable woman had grown into something that touched dozens of lives and challenged fundamental assumptions about race, culture, and the possibility of justice in an unjust world. And in the growing light of a new year, with fresh snow covering the valley like a clean page waiting to be written upon, Sarah and Reed understood that their greatest legacy would not be the ranch they had built or the love they had shared, but the proof they had provided that courage, compassion, and commitment to human dignity could triumph over even the most entrenched prejudices. The transformation was complete. From a moment of brutal injustice to a lifetime of building bridges between worlds that others claimed could never be connected. In choosing love over fear, individual conscience over collective prejudice, they had created something that would outlast their own lives and inspire future generations to continue the work of building a more just and compassionate world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.